GLC presents, brought to you by the donations of our faithful partners.
Shalom. I'm Eddie Chumney of Hebraic Heritage Ministries, and we welcome you today to our study on the Hebraic roots of Christianity. We are doing a series entitled Yeshua from Genesis to Revelation, and this is program number 27 in the series, and today's topic is the task of the 144,000. Now, we need to remember when we're studying the Hebraic roots of Christianity that we must keep everything centered on Yeshua the Messiah. That is because we're told in Psalm in chapter 40, verse 7, "Then said I, Lo, I come, in the volume of the book it is written of me." That verse is quoted in Hebrews in chapter 10 and verse 7, referring to Yeshua, that all of Scripture is written of him. Then Yeshua himself testified in Luke in chapter 24, verse 27 and verse 44, beginning at Moses and all the prophets, he expounded unto them in all the Scriptures the things concerning himself. And he said unto them, These are the words which I spake unto you while I was yet with you, that all things must be fulfilled, which were written in the Torah of Moses and in the prophets and in the Psalms concerning me. So Yeshua told us that the Hebrew Scriptures, the Torah, the prophets, and the Psalms are written of him. So we are doing a study series to understand exactly how that is so, seeing Yeshua in the Torah and understanding how seeing him in the Torah is foundational to understanding what he did at his first coming, to then also understand his second coming and the things that are written in the book of Revelation. So in understanding Yeshua in the Torah, we need to understand that he created the heavens and the earth. He made covenant with Abraham, that he was the rock that led the children of Israel in the wilderness. He was the one that gave the Torah at Mount Sinai. And at Mount Sinai, there was a marriage that took place between the lawgiver and the bridegroom, Yeshua the Messiah, and his bride, who is the house of Jacob, or the nation of Israel. But the house of Jacob, or the nation of Israel, they were unfaithful, and as a result, they were scattered into the nations of the world. And Yeshua's first coming focuses on forgiving the sins of his unfaithful wife in breaking the covenant that he laid down his life for her, and in doing so, that if she would repent of her sins, he would renew the relationship. And we called the renewing of that relationship the new covenant. And the new covenant, Jeremiah 31 verse 31, Hebrews chapter 8 and verse 8, was made with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. That Yeshua himself said in John chapter 10 verses 16 and 17 that he died on the tree for the purpose of taking two sheepfolds and to make them one, which he was going to be the good shepherd over. And then this is repeated in John chapter 11 verses 49 through 52, wherein we're told that Caiaphas, the high priest, prophesied that Yeshua would die for that nation. John chapter 11 and verse 51. But then we're told in John 11 verse 52, and not for that nation only, that Yeshua is dying for two nations who are described in John chapter 11 verse 52, that these two nations are the children of God that are scattered abroad, who are to become one. That Yeshua died to forgive the sins of the house of Jacob, his bride, who broke the covenant. And then in forgiving their sins, he ultimately promised to physically gather them from their exile in the nations of the world where they have been scattered. And we're told that it's the role of the Messiah to gather the exiles of Israel in Jeremiah chapter 23. And we're also told that the Good Shepherd, Yahweh Elohim, will gather the exiles of Israel in Ezekiel in chapter 34. So we're understanding how this is going to happen, and understanding this role and function of the Messiah as revealed and shown to us, some of the details in the book of Revelation. That the setting of the book of Revelation, Revelation chapter 1 verse 10, is John is sharing with us what he is being shown, and he's saying that what he is sharing, he is seeing in the Lord's day. Revelation chapter 1 verse 10, and the prophets refer to this as the day of the Lord. And Paul told us in 2 Thessalonians in chapter 2 in verses 1 and 2 that in the day of Christ, which is another term for the day of the Lord, that we're going to be gathered unto him. That's a reference to the uniting of the 12 tribes of Israel. So in our last several programs, we've been going over what is going to be happening in the world that we can look for to understand when these things are going to be fulfilled. And the prophets tell us that it's going to happen in a period of time when the nations of the world come to divide the land of Israel, Joel chapter 3 and verse 2, in the city of Jerusalem, Zechariah chapter 14 and verse 2. Now this is being fulfilled in our days in which we are living through the efforts of the nations of the world to seek to establish a Palestinian state. And ultimately, when this happens, it will result in the judgment of the nations. And in judging the nations, what the Bible emphasizes within the judgment of the nations is the fall of Babylon in the Babylonian system. And there is going to be a financial judgment upon the world, and then there's also going to be war between the nations. That while the nations are being judged, that is when the God of Israel is going to begin the process to gather his people back to the land and to fulfill the prophecy of Ezekiel 37 verses 15 through 28, which is the uniting of the 12 tribes of Israel. And looking at some details about this, we understand that the uniting of the 12 tribes of Israel is associated with the establishment of biblical Zion. And biblical Zion is defined as the Messiah being the head over all 12 tribes of Israel and being designated by them as their head, as we're told in Hosea chapter 1 and verse 11. They've repented of their sins and they're following his Torah, and he defeats their enemies and sets up his kingdom and rules and reigns with them. So ultimately, biblical Zion is associated with the Messianic era and Messianic times. So how do we know when this gathering from the nations of the world is going to take place for the purpose of uniting the 12 tribes of Israel? Well, we've been studying the meaning of Zion, and Zion in Hebrew is Zion. And Zion, which is Zadi Yod Vav Nun in Hebrew, has the same letters as the Hebrew word Zion. Zion or Zion in Hebrew have the same Hebrew letters as Zion. And Zion means a sign. So the family meaning in the Hebrew language of Zion or Zion, it means a sign. So the establishment of Zion is a sign to the whole world, to the 12 tribes of Israel, but specifically we're told in Jeremiah chapter 31, beginning in verse 15 through verse 22, that it is a sign that Rachel can quit weeping for her children because they're going to return to their border. And who's specifically mentioned there is Ephraim. And that Zion in English is spelled S-C-I-O-N, and S-C-I-O-N in horticulture is the term for grafting. That biblical Zion is the uniting of the 12 tribes of Israel. It's associated with grafting, or the bringing together of northern kingdom and southern kingdom. And so these are the prophecies that we are told that are going to be fulfilled in what's going to happen during the tribulation period. And the joy of ending the exile is likened unto a song. And it's the messianic task. So therefore, the uniting of the 12 tribes of Israel is called the Song of the Lamb in Revelation chapter 15 and verse 3. That we are told in Jeremiah in chapter 31 and verse 7, as this event is associated with joy in singing, it says, sing with gladness for Jacob, and shout among the chief of the nations. Publish ye, praise ye, and say, O Lord, save your people, the remnant of Israel. And I will bring them from the north country and gather them from the coasts of the earth. And then it says in Jeremiah 31 verse 10, hear the word of the Lord, O ye nations, and declare it in the isles afar off, and say, he that scattered Israel will gather him and keep him as a shepherd does his flock. So this event is likened to a song, but when the process happens, it's associated and linked with Passover. And that's what Revelation chapter 12 is about. The woman that has a crown of 12 stars. The 12 stars represents the 12 tribes of Israel united. And that this woman gives birth, and it's a time of travail for her, which is a reference or allusion to the tribulation period, and that when she gives birth, we're told about the fleeing into the wilderness for 1,260 days. That this fleeing in the wilderness is associated with the exiles of Israel returning to the land of Israel. That when the children of Israel came out of Egypt on their way to the promised land, they fled into the wilderness. And we're told in Exodus in chapter 19, in verse 4, you've seen what I did unto the Egyptians, and how I bare you on eagle's wings and brought you unto myself. So in describing going back to the land of Israel and coming out of Egypt, they fled into the wilderness on their way to the promised land. And when they left Egypt, Pharaoh and his army followed them. But Pharaoh and his army, they drowned in the Red Sea. And when Pharaoh and their army drowned in the Red Sea in Exodus chapter 15, that's when the children of Israel sang, and that's called the Song of Moses. Revelation chapter 15 verses 2 and 3 tells us that those who are singing the Song of Moses and the Song of the Lamb, they're doing so because they have gotten the victory over the beast and over the beast system. Revelation in chapter 15 and verse 2. That the joy of this victory then is not only likened to a song, but the song is something of the Messiah. That's why it's called the Song of the Lamb. Now we see the parallel of that the children of Israel, when they came out of Egypt, that when Pharaoh and his army pursued them, and Pharaoh and his army drowned in the Red Sea, because we're told in Exodus 15 verse 6 that it was the right hand that defeated Pharaoh and his army in the Red Sea. We see a parallel in Revelation chapter 12, that when the woman flees in the wilderness for 1,260 days, we see the dragon, which is a reference to the beast and the beast system, because this dragon, we're told in Revelation chapter 12 verse 3, has 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns, who goes on to be described in Revelation chapter 13, that this dragon, or the beast in the beast system, comes after the woman, but we're told in Revelation chapter 12 verse 14 that the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she flies in the wilderness and she's protected. So even as the children of Israel were delivered and coming out of Egypt, the children of Israel and returning back to the land will be delivered from the beast and the beast system, as we see in Revelation chapter 12. Now what we're going to do is we're going to understand Revelation in chapter 7, where we're told about the 144,000. And what we're going to learn is that it is the ministry of the 144,000 to lead the exiles of Israel back to the land during the tribulation period, and that their ministry is associated with the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, the Feast of Tabernacles is called the season of our joy. The Feast of Tabernacles is associated with a harvest festival, and spiritually the harvest of the God of Israel is His people being redeemed. And ultimately they're redeemed and come to Zion. They're redeemed from the nations of the world where they've been scattered during the tribulation period. And there's a reference to the 144,000 in their ministry in the book of Obadiah. Now, Obadiah is only 1 chapter, and the setting of the book of Obadiah in Obadiah chapter 1 verse 15 is the day of the Lord, messianic times. And the last verse of Obadiah says, Saviors will come upon Mount Zion to judge the Mount of Esau, and the kingdom will be the Lord. So Saviors will come on Mount Zion, and the kingdom will be the Lord's. The kingdom being the Lord's is Messiah setting up His kingdom. So what precedes the kingdom being the Lord's is Saviors will come on Mount Zion. And in the Hebrew, the Saviors can be rendered liberators. And in the Torah Anthology, in the book of the 12 Prophets, volume 1 on page 489, and commenting to Obadiah chapter 1 verse 21, that the rabbinical commentary is that those on Mount Zion, among those who are there, are those of the 10 tribes of Israel. In Revelation, in chapter 14 and verse 1, we see the 144,000 when we're told that they're on Mount Zion. Now, why are they on Mount Zion? Because the uniting of the 12 tribes of Israel is associated with coming to Zion. And then in Revelation chapter 14 verse 2, not only are they on Mount Zion, the 144,000, but they're playing their harps. Now, the reason why they're playing their harps is the playing of the harps is associated with the uniting of the 12 tribes of Israel. Going back to Psalm 137 and verse 1, it says, By the rivers of Babylon we sat down and we wept when we remembered Zion. And then it says in verse 2 that we hanged our harps on the willows. And in verse 3, those that carried us away captive required of us a song, saying, Sing us one of the songs of Zion. And the answer is, how shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? I want you to notice that it's in Babylon or in exile that you hang your harp on the willow. And while you're in Babylon, while you're in exile, your harp is hanging on the willow, and you can't play it. So that's when your captors mock and say, Sing us a song of Zion. And the answer is, how shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? So the return to Zion will be being able to play your harp. That's why the 144,000, they're not only on Mount Zion, but they are playing their harps. And then in verse 3, it says they sing a new song. So the Mount Zion and the harps and the new song are all references to the uniting of the 12 tribes of Israel. Now let's see how their ministry is associated with Sukkot. In Revelation chapter 7, we're told about the sealing of the 144,000. And in Revelation chapter 7, verse 9, it says, "After this I beheld, and lo, a great multitude which no man could number, of all nations and kindreds and peoples and tongues." Of all nations and kindreds and peoples and tongues. One of the themes of the Feast of Tabernacles is it's called the Feast of All Nations. And the reason why it's called the Feast of All Nations is in Numbers in chapter 29, where it talks about, in verse 12, on the 15th day of the 7th month, that's the Feast of Tabernacles, you shall keep a feast unto the Lord. Then it goes on to explain that on the first day of the Feast of Tabernacles, that's verse 13, 13 bullocks will be slain. And then on the second day, 12 bullocks. That's verse 17. And then on the third day, 11 bullocks. And each bullock is decreased for each day. So at the end of the 7 days, the total number of bullocks that are slain are 70. And 70 is associated with the number of nations in the earth that goes back to Genesis in chapter 10. That following the flood, in that chapter, if you add up the peoples that are mentioned who makes up the nations of the earth, when the earth gets repopulated, there's going to be associated with 70. And then we're told in Deuteronomy in chapter 32 verse 8, when the Most High divided the nations their inheritance, when he divided the nations, he separated the sons of Adam. He set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of Israel. So the nations of the world are associated with the number of the children of Israel. And so what's the number of the children of Israel? It was the number that went to Egypt. And we see that the number that went to Egypt in Exodus chapter 1 verse 5 is 70. So 70 is going to be associated with the nations of the world. 70 bullocks were slain during the Feast of Tabernacles. Therefore, the Feast of Tabernacles is known as the Feast of All Nations. And so we have an allusion to that in Revelation chapter 7 verse 9, that what was seen there is those from all nations and kindreds and peoples and tongues. And then they're waving palms in their hands in Revelation chapter 7 verse 9. Waving palms is associated with the Feast of Tabernacles because in Leviticus in chapter 23 and verse 40, there's a commandment that during the Feast of Tabernacles you're to wave palms. And then in verse 10, they cried with a loud voice, "Salvation to our God." Now in the first century, in the time of the temple, during the Feast of Tabernacles, that there would be a ceremony where you went around the altar once during the Feast of Tabernacles, but on the seventh day of the Feast of Tabernacles, you went around the altar 7 times. And in doing so, these words were said, "Salvation to our God." So in Revelation chapter 7, verses 9 and 10, the ministry of the 144,000 is thematically being associated with the Feast of Tabernacles. Then there's a question that's asked in Revelation chapter 7, verse 13. Who are these that came out of the great tribulation? Where did they come from? Who are these who are arrayed in white robes? Is the question. Who are these who are arrayed in white robes? That's Revelation chapter 7, verse 13. The answer in Revelation chapter 7, verse 14 is, these are they that came out of great tribulation. And so in describing those that came out of great tribulation, here's what's said about them. Revelation chapter 7 verse 16, "They will hunger no more, they will thirst no more, neither shall the sun light upon them nor any heat. For the Lamb which is in the midst of the throne will feed them, he will lead them into living fountains of water, and God will wipe away all tears from their eyes." The answer that is given, that who are these that came out of Great Tribulation, that is a quote. Revelation chapter 7 verses 16 and 17 is a quote from Isaiah in chapter 49 and verse 10. In the context of Isaiah chapter 49 and verse 6, it says that you would be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the preserved of Israel. The subject is gathering the 12 tribes of Israel. That in Isaiah 49:9, that you may say to the prisoners, go forth. The prisoners are the exiles of Israel. Going forth is ending their exile. So here's what it says about the prisoners going forth in Isaiah 49 and verse 10. They will not hunger nor thirst, neither will the heat nor sun smite them. For he that has mercy on them will lead them, even by springs of water shall he guide them. Now that verse, Isaiah chapter 49 verse 10, is the answer to the question in Revelation chapter 7 verse 13, who are these who are arrayed in white robes, and where did they come from? So the ones that came out of great tribulation decoded the answer, given that Revelation chapter 7 verses 16 and 17 is a quote of Isaiah chapter 49 verse 10, that those that came out of great tribulation are the gathering of the 12 tribes of Israel. And who are being used to gather them? It is the 144,000. The 144,000 are playing the role of Moses. They are what I call the Moses company. So the reason why we're told about the 144,000 here in the book of Revelation in chapter 7, is because the 144,000 played the role of being the leaders to gather the exiles of Israel back to the land. And so I pray that the message today has been a blessing to you. Now remember these words from 1 John chapter 2 and verse 6. He who says he abides in him, he who says he's a believer in Yeshua as the Messiah, ought himself to walk, that is to live our lives, even as he walked. How did Yeshua walk? He followed the Torah, and believers in him should do the same. Shalom in Yeshua the Messiah. Amen.